let's just roll through. So, in terms of startup communities, um, I wrote a book recently called Startup Communities Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. And I wouldn't be a good book salesman if I didn't put up the URL. So here's the URL. That's the URL. So that, nope, that's not the URL. Sorry.
No.
Bad book salesman. Here's the book. Here's the URL. In that book, I spent a lot of time thinking about what had happened in Boulder, Colorado, that's caused Boulder to be what's now viewed as a nationally recognized, internationally recognized startup hub. I've lived here in Boulder for 17 years, but I've invested all around the U.S., and I lived in Boston for a dozen years before I lived here. So I spent a lot of time in lots of different startup communities, lots of different cities, involved in lots of different technology companies. And essentially, I started thinking hard in 2010 about what those drivers and what the dynamics were. And I came to a place where I now have a deeply held belief that you can create startups in any city in the world, and that in fact every city should have a vibrant startup community as part of it. Now, the startup community is only a piece of the broader city or community that you live in, but it ends up being a very vital part of a growing city because much of the innovation, new job creation, fresh ideas, things that attract new people to the region of any age tend to be driven much more by startups than by anything else. And as a result, having a very vibrant startup community is super important. I came up with a set of 4 principles, and I'll lay them out for you. I call the 4 principles the Boulder thesis because I needed a name for them, and the Boulder thesis was as good as any. I believe that if you adopt these 4 principles, you can build a startup community anywhere. So let me walk you through them and give you a little context about each. The first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. In my worldview, I separate all the people who participate in the startup community into 2 categories, leaders and feeders. And both categories, both leaders and feeders, are extremely important to a startup community. It's not the case that one's more important than the other, or that one is superior or subordinate, but they play very different roles. The feeders are organizations like university, government, investors like venture capitalists and angel investors, large companies, service providers like the lawyers and accountants, essentially the people who contribute to the ecosystem around entrepreneurship. Now, the leaders have to be the entrepreneurs. Now, it turns out that individual members of feeder organizations can play leadership roles. So you can have a professor that plays a leadership role, you can have somebody in government play a leadership role, a member of a big company play a leadership role, even a venture capitalist play a leadership role. But the institutions themselves, the organizations, can't be the leaders. It has to be people. And in the absence of a critical mass of entrepreneurs, you don't make any progress. And a critical mass of entrepreneurs doesn't have to be 100. It can be 5 or 10. And when I say entrepreneurs, I mean entrepreneurial leaders, people who are committed to being leaders of the entrepreneurial community. The second principle of the Boulder thesis is that these leaders have to take a very long-term view. And what I mean by this is at least a generational view, 20 plus years. I've been in Boulder for 17 years now, and I don't describe it as I'm 17 years onto a 20-year journey. I'm 17 years onto a 37-year journey. You have to have this very long-term view for a variety of reasons. Startups take a long time. Anybody who believes that you can start a company and in 24 months have it be worth $1 billion, it happens every now and then. But the normal case is that it takes 5, 10, 15 years to create a real company. And entrepreneurs have to be committed for this very long journey on their own company. And the same is true in the context of the startup communities. Now, all of those organizations that are feeders operate on a different time scale. Government tends to operate on 2- and 4-year cycles with an election in the middle. So they kind of have 1 to 3 years of productive work. Academia, university tends to operate on annual cycles unless you're trying to get tenure, in which case the only thing you care about for 7 years is getting tenure. Big companies tend to work on monthly, quarterly, annual rhythms. These are rhythms that are not the rhythm of the startup community. Startup community takes a very long time to develop and to build. The third principle is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. This is a super important idea. You know, you can attribute it to feel-good hippiness of Boulder, but really what you want is you want to make it easy and welcoming for anyone who wants to participate in the startup community. Anyone who wants to engage in a leadership role, anybody who wants to take on an activity, anybody who wants to show up, they should feel welcome and be able to get involved. Now, part of the driver here is that there's no one that controls a startup community. There's no president of the startup community. There's no vice president of membership or vice president of education. So if the participants all have this view of inclusiveness, people have a way to get involved and engage in things. You also, as part of this, have to have an attitude that we talk about over and over again in Boulder, which we call give before you get. Let me illustrate give before you get with a specific example, which is the difference between a mentor and an advisor. I'm sure you all have heard the word mentor a lot lately. It's become a very popular phrase. It's important to get the definition right. An advisor, of which has existed forever and the world has a lot of, is somebody who, when asked if they get involved with your company, say, I'd be happy to be involved if you give me 1% of your company. Or I'd be happy to get involved if you give me a $3,000 a month retainer. A mentor, when asked, says very simply, how can I help? The mentor doesn't have a transactional view of the relationship. He's giving before he gets. He doesn't have an idea of what he's going to get out of the interaction or the relationship, but he's willing to invest energy in the relationship with the expectation that as a mentor, he or she will get back a lot. And in fact, the most powerful mentor-mentee relationships are ones where the mentor learns as much or more from the mentee over the course of what can be a very long-term relationship. So that's what I mean by give before get. Once you're part of the startup community, if you carry that attitude with you everywhere, this notion of I want to be inclusive of everybody that engages, and I want to put energy into the system because I believe I'm going to get something out even though I'm not totally sure what I'm going to get out of it, very, very good things happen. The fourth principle is the notion of having activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. And by this, I don't mean Entrepreneur of the Year awards. Those things are fine. But they're not critical. I don't mean things like expensive dinners or cocktail parties at some rich person's house where there's networking. Again, fine, but not the thing you need. What you need is you need things like Startup Weekend, which is 54 hours of a simulation of entrepreneurship where a bunch of people get. How many people in the room have been to a Startup Weekend? I'm sure that you've had some, and that's awesome. How many people thought that Startup Weekend was an awesome experience? All right, good. Almost all the same people. You basically are shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of other people who are interested in starting companies or who have started companies, working together to do something. You're not just talking to each other. You're not listening to some dude on Google Hangout pontificate about things. You're actually doing stuff. And that's what I mean by activities and events that engage the entrepreneurial stack. Accelerators like Techstars is another example. 90-day accelerator program where the entrepreneurs that go through the program are working on their companies, 10 or a dozen companies, and they're surrounded by mentors who are working with them to help create their companies and build their businesses. Now, the neat thing about these activities and events is that you don't have to get permission to start them. You don't have to get a license. You don't have to apply for something. You don't have to pay a fee. You can just start. So if you want to have a new tech meetup that's focused on people that are doing mobile development on iOS, you can just start. If you want to have a weekly open coffee club at the local coffee shop and invade it, they'll be happy to have you as long as you buy coffee from them. If you don't have to wait for something to happen to start to engage people. Now, if you take this idea of having continual activities and events, not one, not two, not 5 a month, but all the time, this idea of being inclusive of anybody who wants to engage at any level, this long-term view, you're not going to solve it in 1 year. You're trying to do something over the next 20 years. And this construct that the leaders have to be entrepreneurs and you have to have a critical mass of them to make progress. If you combine those things together, year after year after year, month after month after month, you'll have steady progress in the startup community, independent of what's happening in the macro environment, independent of what the stock market's doing, independent of who's president, independent of what team won the Super Bowl. Because most of the stuff, if you're an entrepreneur like that, is just entertainment. It's actually not what you're focused on. If you're an entrepreneur, you're focused and obsessed with your company. And your company fills almost all your available time. And your startup community is an important part of the development of your company. Because as an entrepreneur, if you want to recruit people, it's a lot easier to recruit people if you're engaged with all the people that are entrepreneurs. If you're trying to understand what technology trends are interesting and you're struggling to figure out customer dynamics, having peers and mentors that you can interact with are important. If you want to attract financing to your company, having a more visible startup community with lots more companies that are raising money and attracting investors, whether they're angel investors or venture investors, will bring them to your community. So the notion of this is to go on a long-term journey, where that journey is one where you're both building a company and building your community around this notion of entrepreneurship. So that's the 15-minute preamble. Again, happy to answer questions about this and go deep on this. Also happy to answer questions about anything else, venture capital, angel investing, technology, what kind of microphone I use for my Google Hangouts, whatever's interesting to you.
So just for everybody in the room, if you want, you can come up to the laptop here, and then Brad can see you and hear you from the microphone. So if you'd like to form a line or whatever you'd like to do, you're welcome to do that. Brad, I'll start. So one thing I'm encountering as a student who's coming up from graduation soon in May is that one thing startups don't do nearly as well as these large corporations is recruiting people. It's really hard for startups to find me and for me to find startups. Do you have any hints on how to get into that community and how to actually find these different jobs all around the United States?
Yes. Let me find a link that I'll put up real quick. Of course, they have lousy SEO, so that's not working. There's an organization at CU Boulder, I talk about it pretty extensively in the book, called Startup to Students. Here, hang on one sec. All right, here's the link. You guys can look at it later. Essentially, the story at CU and CU Boulder is exactly what you just described. And one of the students, a guy named Ben, decided one day that he was tired of having his soul sucked out of his body by the large companies that came by to recruit him, and he wanted to work for a startup. But he was having trouble finding the startups. So Ben decided to get a bunch of other students together, and those students started something that's now called Startup to Student. And this is a bunch of years ago. Here's another link. And what they ended up doing was having a reverse recruiting event. So instead of the students getting recruited by the companies or pitching themselves to the companies pitched themselves to the students. And last year when I went, there were about 150 students that showed up and about 15 companies. And what happened was there was pizza. I think there was beer for people that were old enough to drink beer, although in Colorado I think they closed their eyes on that. And although I'm probably not supposed to say that. And the companies got up and gave each 15 company gave a 3 or 4 minute presentation on the company and the kind of people they're looking for. And then afterwards, there was a mixer. And so you ended up with a whole bunch of students getting involved in a whole bunch of the startups who are looking for them. That was one example. Another thing which we did last year was something that was really amazing called Startup Summer. That's a second link that I just put up there. And what Startup Summer was a number of us organized as part of Startup Colorado, organized 15 companies, different companies, some of the same, but different companies, who each hired a student for the summer, at least one, as an intern. And they paid a real summer wage. I think it was a $5,000 for the summer for the students. The students spent 40 hours a week working at the startup, and then evenings participating with Techstars and some of the evening events of Techstars, having some direct lectures, and then working on their startups. And then at the end of the summer program, the students presented to all of these companies their startups. Many of these students got hired for permanent jobs by the companies, the startups that they were working with. In both of these cases, nobody asked the university permission. So there wasn't a thing where we went to the university career development office or whatever they call them and said help. Startup to Students was literally Ben and a student organization much like yours just deciding to run a thing where they found all the local startups and had them come in and pitch to students who cared. And the summer program was a couple of us, me being one of them, getting about 15 companies to be willing to pay for the summer internship program. So the point of those two examples is you cannot expect the startups to come to you. So the entrepreneurs running the startups are just too busy. They can't lift their heads up and see it. And if you want to be involved in the startups, you got to go find them. And as students, you're in this great position because you're relatively cheap to keep alive. And because you're relatively inexpensive to keep alive, you can overperform relative to your cost for these startups, and then they'll never let you go.
Okay. Hey, Brad.
Hey.
I'm Jim.
Hey, Jim.
All right. There. I got two questions. First of all, is your partner there? Is he a leader or a feeder?
Which partner?
A guy over your right shoulder.
Oh, this guy? That guy?
Yeah.
He keeps me safe. I originally named him Minotaur, because that's what he is. And my musical partner came in one day and decided his name was Pat. So now we call him Pat Minotaur.
All right, cool. All right, great. Hey, my second question is, have you had experience in either in Boulder or in other communities that you've gotten involved with where there is a feeder organization that is trying to be a leader, and if so, how do you talk them down?
All the time. You see it everywhere in the world, and it's one of the biggest challenges.
Right.
So,
we got some of that around here, so I just want to get some of your experience on that.
So thing number one, which I found to be highly effective and somewhat entertaining, actually, is give them a copy of Startup Communities.
I got a couple when I was over at Kaufman last week. Yeah.
So give them a copy, and then when you're ready, after you believe they've read it, let's do a video call with me.
Yeah?
Sometimes the mere fact that they'd have to do a video call with me will cause them to start to get a clue. Because they'll read the book and they'll get it. Like, essentially what happens is this fascinating dynamic where most of the people who are running feeder organizations or in feeders, they're trying to do good. They're not trying to do harm. And the problem is that their brains are wired not like entrepreneurs. That's why they're in these other organizations. And so really what they need is they need a sense of, oh, I get it. My job is to help and support, not try to control. Mm-hmm. Now, there's always some people that doesn't work with. But I've found it's very interesting. I've shown up in places where I've given talks, and the people who are part of economic development, university, I had a funny intro from a university professor recently where the university professor literally introduced himself as, I'm a feeder. And he says, now let me introduce Brad Feld. And I said, I'm a feeder too. Like, I play a leadership role, but I'm part of a feeder. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's helping people understand what's actually underneath it. And hopefully, if I've done something useful, it's in the context of this book, is put it in a long form so it's not just a blog post that somebody reads. They actually have to think about it. Yeah. If they're serious about helping the startup community and they're not willing to put some mental energy into understanding those dynamics.
Okay. So I heard here an offer of a video call.
Totally happy if you organize some of your feeders.
Right? Witnesses, good. All right.
Yeah, witnesses, fine. If you organize some feeders, my only requirement is that they have read the book in advance.
Or at least they said they have.
You can't. We can verify very easily. I'll give them a test.
All right. There you go. Good. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Brad. My name's Matt.
Hey, Matt.
I work with a tech accelerator here in St. Louis called Capital Innovators. You may have heard of us.
Awesome. Yes, I have.
Great, great. So my question is around sort of how startup communities are viewed in the Midwest versus the coast. And I think a lot of the things that you mentioned in your book are really empowering for folks in the Midwest to say that this is something that we can build in our backyard. So my question is, where does Colorado fit in that for you, sort of this Midwest versus coast dichotomy, and where do you think it's headed?
Well, Colorado is definitely not on a coast. It's unambiguous there. I also don't think, I got asked this question earlier today on the Wall Street Journal Accelerators thing that I did, or somebody brought up this question about sort of, do you have to be on the coast, on either the East Coast or the West Coast to have a successful startup community, successful company, that sort of thing? My answer is no, you don't, and stop worrying about it. Because one of the things I think that's happened, I was in Des Moines, and I had dinner with a bunch of the startup Des Moines people one night before Think Iowa, which was an awesome event. One of the, as good as any event I've ever gone to that was an entrepreneur-focused event. And the dinner before with the 20 or so entrepreneurs, I must have heard, 50 times, 100 times as self-deprecating, but we're in the Midwest, or we're more conservative, or we don't take as much chances, or like, I finally said, guys, cut the shit. Like, just stop. Like you're making this up. This is not actually truth. And what happens is that by saying it over and over again, you create a culture where everybody sort of leans back. Versus by saying, you know what, doesn't matter. We're not trying to compare ourselves to Silicon Valley. We're not trying to be the next New York. We're trying to be the great thing that St. Louis can be. Or we're trying to be the great thing that Kansas City can be, or the great thing that Des Moines can be, or the great thing, pick a city. And that's what's so important, because I call it a startup community, because you get to define where that community is. So I think your question's a really, really important one, because it's a problem, it's a challenge that people come up with over and over again. They create this barrier in a geography, in a region, culturally. When I moved to Boulder, well, the first thing people said is, why the hell are you moving to Boulder? There's nothing there except a bunch of hippies. And I said, oh, that's probably why I'm moving to Boulder. There's a bunch of hippies there. What's wrong with that? But what I heard when I got here by other people, I was investing on, Boston, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, LA. I mean, those were my normal sort of routes in the mid-'90s, place where I spent my time. And people said, yeah, there's a lot of smart people in Boulder, but, nobody works very hard. They go home at 5 o'clock. They ride their mountain bikes in the middle of the day. Like, they're not hungry. And I got here, and I'm like, I don't know what you people are talking about. These people work just as hard as anybody else on the planet, and they don't have a 2-hour commute to work each way. And they don't have this soul-crushing experience of going grocery shopping because you have to pay $15 to park, and then you have to haul your groceries. Like, really, it's just different. And it's different in terms of the reason people want to live there. but that doesn't have anything to do with their level of intensity and focus around startups and creating companies. So just grab onto that. The last part of your question is, how do I think of Boulder in the geography? I think of Boulder as Boulder. It's another thing that I think is super important is you already have your brand. Like people say, well, should we call ourselves Silicon that, or should we come up with a name? How should we brand what's going on in, Atlanta? I'm like, it's called Atlanta. When people say Atlanta, it means something to them. And you get to build off of that as a startup community rather than creating your own separate thing.
Great. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Brad. My name is Paul.
Hey, Paul.
Here we go. Yeah, so our company, we do mobile ad optimization. That's our specialty. And we're considering doing a funding round, but we really want to make sure that we have people and mentors that really fit well with our company. So my question is, what's the best way to reach out to these funding programs that may not know about you? And do you have any insight from your Foundry experience?
Sure. How much money are you trying to raise?
Due to FCC rules, I don't think we can say that.
Yeah, you can. This is a private conversation.
Between $500,000 to $2 million.
Okay, that's helpful. So let me give you some feedback. First off, $500,000 to $2 million is too big a range.
Okay, $500,000.
They're totally different between raising $500,000 and $2 million. Okay, if you're raising $500,000, then the people you're going to raise money from are either going to be angel investors or seed VCs. The seed VCs are ones that are already going to have an affinity either for mobile, you, or where you are geographically. The angel investors are mostly going to be investing in you and your team. And interestingly, the angel investors that you're going to find for a $500,000 funding round are probably people you either already know or someone you know knows. So the interesting if you're really only raising 500, the neat thing is that that's not that much money in the grand scheme of things. $2 million is a much harder amount of money to raise than 500, because when you're raising $2 million, now you really need some institutional support. For most early stage companies, you need to find some kind of venture firm that's willing to write a check that's substantive, $1 million or more. I like to say break up your round into 3 categories. Category 1 is the people who are going to lead. Category 2 is the people that are going to follow. And category 3 is random. Category number 1, each of those are about a third. So if you're raising 500, each of those is about $150,000, $175,000. So you need to find about $150,000 from one or more people who are going to be actively leading your financing. Am I not hearing? You're not hearing me?
We can hear you, but we can't see. All right, you stopped moving for a while.
It's okay now?
Yeah, it's good now.
I was too excited. The first third, you need to find $150,000 worth of people who are willing to be leads to your financing. Those people will probably drag along in some characterization $150,000. So they'll have friends who like to follow what they're doing. Not every single one of the people who are leads, but one of them might have a couple of people that follow them. And then once your financing starts to come together, magically, you'll start to have other people come out of the woodwork that want to write $25,000 or $50,000 checks. So what you're focusing really on doing is finding somewhere between 1 and 3 or 4 people who all can write $25,000 to $100,000 checks to fill up that first $150,000 bucket.
Okay, so break it up.
But think about it from that perspective and think about who you know. Now, if somebody says, I'm interested in investing $25,000, call me when the round comes together. Or you meet somebody and you've met with them 7 times and they're still not committing, but they're still taking the meeting, they're probably in that second category. So pushing them too hard isn't any good, but communicating with them and keeping them up to date on your progress does make some good sense. So that's how I think about it. I think for $500,000, I wouldn't over-optimize running around. I mean, you can put your company up on Angel List and see what happens, but unless you have a strong referrer, a strong endorsement, and start to have some momentum, it's really just a way for you to have, either randomness happen or the company up there. But AngelList is a good place to do something around that. Applying to accelerators, if you're thinking about going through an accelerator, apply to some. Well, you're in the one in there, right?
Yeah, Capital Innovators.
So you're in Capital Innovators. So they're going to have a group of angel investors and probably some seed venture investors around the accelerator. That's going to be your target audience. But if you can live off of $500,000, raise that instead of $2 million. I like to say raise the least amount of money you need to make to the next level. And the reason that's so important is you want to make the fundraising at the early stage as easy as you can, and you actually want to raise less money because you want to own more of the company. And there's a number. You need a number. If you needed $2 million, you need $2 million. But I could argue with you why you probably didn't, based on what you look like in mobile ad optimization and sort of where you are in the overall curve.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Brad. How's it going?
I'm good.
Thanks, first of all, for doing this. I guess before I ask my question, I'm going to give you a little bit of context, so it kind of puts everything in perspective. I have a digital publication for the life. It's a college lifestyle publication, and I see a couple of large changes that are kind of taking place, and I'm trying to position. We're growing pretty quickly, and I'm trying to kind of build an infrastructure so we can publish better and better content. And a couple of the changes I foresee happening that affect my decision on my business plan is, one, the change of the higher education institution. I recently I was in Columbia and saw the director of 2U say that a lot of institutions aren't going to exist by 2015 because of the kind of the higher education bubble, and secondly, the fact that a lot of companies aren't making that much money in banner advertisement. And so I guess my idea that I have right now is to offer the experience and an internship to a lot of students, and then actually sell the resource of my publication and my partners to higher institutions for experiential learning. And I don't know if that kind of fills in kind of where I'm at, but what advice would you give to online publications that are kind of trying to navigate a lot of changes that are kind of going on right now?
So two things. One is I don't feel like I'm a particularly significant domain expert, so any advice I'd give you is probably generic. And the second is, one of the things, and I'll just use this as an object lesson, it's very, very hard for anyone to give precise advice in the sort of general case. So you'll get a lot of investors who will give you that advice, but it's usually just random information. So I could give you an answer that's a piece of random information, which might or might not be right and might or might not be helpful. And one of the things to try to do, and this is now the generic advice I'd give you that sort of applies to your case, is always be testing hypotheses. Always have a hypothesis about how something's going to work, and continually run experiments against that hypothesis. And some things are going to be right and some things are going to be wrong, but you're going to learn from it as you go. And so if you have a precise question, frame it as a hypothesis. Here's what my business is doing. I'm thinking about doing this specifically. What's your experience with that? Or what's the positive or weakness of that? Now, you sort of asked me that at the end, right? But because I'm not a domain expert, I don't really have I don't totally get what you said in terms of the link between higher education and, when you said higher education is going to be, a bunch of higher education institutions are going to be out of business by 2015, I didn't listen to the next 10 seconds of what you said because I was thinking about whether I agreed with that or not, and I don't agree with that. Right, so whoever said that, I think, is saying a provocative statement. That's not necessarily something I agree with, but it doesn't mean anything because I don't have any specific knowledge about it. Right, so use that frame. So I'll give you, sort of second chance. In the question, is there a specific thing that you want to try to do in that linkage between customer, which is higher education, your publications, and the students that you're interacting with. Is there a specific question?
Yeah, well, let's just focus on, I guess, banner advertisement. Where do you see, and you say you don't know a lot about domains. I don't know if this is still not...
I meant the domain of higher education content stuff.
Okay, okay.
Not domains like brad.com.
Right. Do you see a good chance for online publications to make money through advertising still?
Yes.
Okay. Could you be specific on what you see?
I don't think small ones can make money off of boxes and rectangles, which are what banner ads are commonly referred to. But I think that if you can build a loyal audience because you have substantive content, there's lots of ways to monetize that content both directly and indirectly. You know, if you're at 1 million daily active users, so 1 million people a day who are looking at your site, you can have a decent business, unique people a day, you can have a decent business in banner advertising. But less than that, and what you're really looking for is affiliate marketing opportunities. You're looking for any sort of link optimization type activity to drive people to that link sharing. We have a company that we've invested in called LinkSmart that is building out an exchange so that if you have traffic that you want to send to somebody else and they'll value that traffic at a certain amount off of a keyword, somebody that hits your site but then hits a keyword and goes to their site, you know, they're going to be willing to pay you something more meaningful than the traffic that you might get from another page view. So all of those things are possible, but for a relatively low to modest traffic site, so, you know, anywhere under, you know, 10,000 daily users, you can't make any meaningful money. So you have to have a different model. Subscription is probably the most logical model there. So what's the value that you're providing to those 10,000 people? And if you can get up to 100,000, it's some blend of it. But you're going to have to be creative, and you have to stand out in the noise a lot more than you used to have to.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Brad, I'm David.
Hello, David.
I'm a partner in a marketing agency, and we're also entrepreneurs. So we've got a business that part of our business model is to. I'm creative director, and at some point the ink's going to run out of my pen. So we'd like to invest in other things. So we've got a couple ideas that we've come up with and are building businesses around those. And that's going okay. But my question is for the other businesses that we work with. So when we're working with a startup or an entrepreneur, our sweet spot is companies that are $1 million to $75 million. Our soft spot is for startups and entrepreneurs. And when we've worked with them in the past, we've either done it on a pro bono basis, and that's been great, and it's been very helpful for them. Or we've done it on a very discounted rate basis, and we haven't lost money, we haven't made money, and we've really helped them a lot. How do we stay in this role and help them in a sustainable way? So how can I discount my services or give my services for free, and someday, you know, we don't have anything with these companies saying someday you're going to have to pay us if you make it big.
Right.
It's just sort of like hoping that they will, and in the meantime, we're living vicariously as they grow. So what advice would you have for a feeder, or I guess a feeder? We're a service provider in that.
Sure.
Sense.
So there's two choices, right? One choice is continue to just do it because you enjoy doing it and you want to help out the broader ecosystem, and you know it's not a meaningful net loss activity for you in terms of interfering with other time that you're spending. So you can view it as the way you're viewing it today. If you want to have future upside, about the only way that you can have future upside that you can structure it is to take some equity in these companies. And it's not unheard of for a service provider, whether it be a law firm or an agency or somebody else, to say, look, we'll do this work for free, and what we want is we want some stock options in exchange for it, so that if you're ever successful, we have a payoff from the stock options. And you know that's something that if you have a reputation for doing really great work for startups, is probably a palatable thing. If you don't have a reputation and you're just trying to get business that way, right? So your firm doesn't fall into this category, but there are plenty of people who show up and say, look, I want to get some business. I charge $5,000 a month. The startup says, I can't afford $5,000 a month. And the person says, well, give me $2,000 a month and some equity. All that's happening there is the person's looking for work, right? So you've already developed a reputation of saying, no, we're willing to help. Like, we're really in this to help build this. We just want a payoff if there's a payoff for you at the end. And, you know, in that context, taking some stock options and putting them in a drawer, you know, just you're basically investing your time as though an investor was investing cash.
And that's not putting an undue, because I really don't understand the financial side of it, but for them to write up options, that's not going to affect their, like, I mean, you can't just write options, or can
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's 100% of any company to give out. So if they give you options, they're giving away some of the company. The percentage that they give you would be very small, right? So your expectation shouldn't be that you're getting 10% of their company.
Sure.
Your expectation might be that you're getting 1/10% of the company or 1/4% of the company. Now, if it's a two-person startup and they have no history yet, and they haven't incorporated and it's just two people working on it, then it's hard for them to do that. But if it's a company that's raised $500,000 of angel money, like the other fellows, or it's a company that has, you know, been around for a little while and has been bootstrapping, they may have a way to do that legally that's not an undue burden on them. That's if you want to actually participate in it. You can also say to them, look, we're going to help you anyway, and if something good happens, give us something. Right? This is the purely mentor-driven approach. And I'll give you an example. I help the company.
Sort of what we've been doing.
And again, if it's not impacting your business negatively, that's an okay way to play. So an example I would give you is I was an advisor to a company or mentor to a company, to an entrepreneur. They built a business that got bought. I helped them a lot during. I never was an investor, so I never owned any of the company. And at the end of the business, when they got bought, I helped them a lot with the sale. Spent a lot of time helping them negotiate the sale. Didn't ask for anything, just did it. They turned around post-sale and they made a very significant contribution to a nonprofit that I'm chairman of, that they also supported. But the founders took money out of their pockets and they made a charitable contribution. You know, the other thing I tell you is think about how you can help these companies the most. If you have, as a firm, you know, some profit, some resources, and you decide, look, we want to invest every year on an annual basis. We'll invest $100,000 into the 4 startups that we choose to work with this year. So $25,000 a startup. And what you can say to them is, look, we're going to do the work for free, but we'd also like to invest $25,000 in your company, in your financing, when the financing happens, because we'd like to have a stake in the upside. Now, the hard-nosed businessman will say, oh, that's a terrible deal. You're investing in them and you're helping them. But then the person who's taking a longer-term view recognizes it's a tiny, fragile little startup. If they turn into something meaningful, they'll probably hire you and you'll get your fees and then some. And in the meantime, you're giving them something at an early point in their life which they need more than anything else, which is some fuel, you know, and some help. And again, as long as that doesn't impact your business, it's a good way to participate in the startup community.
That's real helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
I do have an unrelated question.
Go for it.
Not quite a follow-up. We're doing some work for large universities' technology transfer office. What words of wisdom do you have about university IP? They're very interested in taking their IP that their professors and students and whatever develop and turning that into businesses. It's turning, helping the entrepreneurial community and hooking them up with either mentors or investors. I mean, if you could just, I don't know, like talk for a few minutes, rant for a few minutes about the university IP situation, that'd be great. And then I'll get the hell out of your face.
One quick question on this one in particular, and I don't need to know the name. Is it a publicly funded university or private university?
Yes.
Publicly funded. Okay. So here's the dynamic of this. I write a lot about this in startup communities. I'm pretty outspoken about my views here. I think technology transfer offices and the notion of technology transfer from university at some levels is very inappropriate and totally offensive. So if you think about the dynamic, much of the funding for these programs, especially in a public university, has come from the public, right? It's either public, grants or state funding. The research often is federal funding for the specific research being done. So it's money that's taxpayer money going to the university, which the university is then trying to capture ownership over the innovation that this public money has provided to them in the first place. And there's a law change called the Bayh-Dole Act that changed the dynamic. Up to a point in the early 1980s, this research was for the public good. So it wasn't actually the property of the university. The Bayh-Dole Act changed that and created this notion of technology transfer offices. Now, some technology transfer offices are very effective. There are some very powerful, positive examples, and the one I try to point people at is Stanford. So if you go on the web and type Stanford TTO or Stanford Technology Transfer and just sort of look around, you'll eventually run into a handful of relatively recent presentations and descriptions of how they do things and how they think about it. And what Stanford has done is have a very, very lightweight licensing agreement. They ask for a relatively small ownership stake in the company being licensed, and they do as much as they can to help facilitate the licensing of that to companies that get created by students, professors, and funded externally. By having this sort of view of making it very low friction and taking a relatively small ownership stake, in the companies that become super successful, the entrepreneurs are generally very appreciative and turn around and give back to the university way more money than the university would have ever gotten if they'd been more hard-nosed about the negotiation on the front end. And more importantly, in many cases, technology transfer offices stifle innovation. The best entrepreneurs don't want to have anything to do with it. Or the business people are so frustrated by the process, or the investors are so frustrated by the process that they don't even bother. Or in some cases, students aren't allowed, undergraduate and postgraduate students aren't allowed to have equity in these companies from the research they've been doing. And so they have a choice. They can leave the university, or they can and join the company or stay at the university. So the more sort of entangled and complicated the rules and dynamics are, and the more of a more reaching the university is, the less successful over time those technology transfer programs have been. So
I think that's what I think they would model themselves, like to be modeled more after how you're describing Stanford. They're looking at it like, we've got all this IP sitting there, all this potential energy that's doing nothing, and the governor and the state are saying, use this to create jobs.
That's great. I mean, if the attitude is, we want to get this stuff out, we want to have a small stake in case it's super successful, we want to make it easy, and we want to have a context of trust where we're trying to get this out into the hands of people that are going to do something with it, because it's basically just sitting on our shelves and decaying right now.
Right.
That's a good attitude. That's a good approach. And that is it's a more positive and more enlightened approach than what many TTOs have.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Real helpful.
Sure. All right, two more questions, just because I have to pay attention to time.
What up, Brad? My name's Dylan. I'm the organizer of our local meetup group here called Start Lewis for startups, entrepreneurs.
Did you have to get a license to do that?
No, we just did it. Yeah. Every first Tuesday of the month, everybody wants to come. My question is, we have a lot of first-timers in our group. So from the perspective of first-time entrepreneurs, not in a major startup hub, where do you come on the spectrum of like micropreneurship versus like scalable startup? On the micropreneurship side, you might be able to do it yourself without a co-founder, without funding, or you could get a co-founder and shoot for the stars, but you might need to get funding then. What do you think about all that?
I don't think there are any right or wrong answers, and I think it evolves over time. And recognize that the company that a person does on day X may not be the thing they're working on, on X plus 3 years. or X plus 4 years. So the process of creating companies is a continuum that happens over a long period of time rather than an absolute thing that happens at one moment in time. And let it be that kind of a dynamic. So I would encourage you to have all of those different categories involved. I'd also say, advise something I said earlier is, while you can have successful single founder companies, they're much, much harder. And in a lot of ways, they're much less fun because you don't have somebody to work on with. And people talk about, well, but yeah, of course there were single founder companies. You hear these famous stories of entrepreneurs. You hear famous stories of entrepreneurs, but oftentimes there were 2 or 3 or 4 founders. You just don't hear about the other founders because one of the entrepreneurs had a bigger ego than everybody else. Or one of the entrepreneurs was the one that everybody talked about. Or one of the other partner toiled away happily, without the public limelight. And so having 2 or 3 founders at the beginning, in a lot of ways, even if you're self-funding a company, gives you a lot more learning and a lot more leverage over the life of the company. But I would, again, go back to inclusive. I would be inclusive of everyone. I wouldn't segment that way.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. Last one.
Hey Brad, it's Chris Peterson. I'm a valuation consultant here in St. Louis.
Hey Chris.
Hey, I was just wondering if you noticed any trends in the venture capital industry right now, or if you could speak on these so-called super angels that are coming up.
Sure. So there have been a lot of vibrations, I would say, rather than change in the venture industry over the last decade. For me, I don't view the venture capital thing as an industry. If you think about the amount of venture capital that's deployed every year, it's a pretty tiny number. It's $20 billion in total. And some years it's 15 billion, and there probably were years that it was 10 billion. But as an absolute number, it's a pretty small number. It has a very disproportionate impact because many of the companies that raise venture capital end up being very fast-growing, high-growth companies. And people like to talk about it a lot. The broadest 2 shifts that have happened in venture capital since about 2006, 2007 was something that really had very little to do with venture capital itself. The first is you have had the ability to fund a company at the beginning with radically less money. So the amount of money that you need to raise to get through a first product ship, to get through your proof of concept, to get something into the market, you can credibly raise $500,000 and launch a mobile ad targeting company. Whereas 20 years ago, you needed $10 or $15 million before you were even really in the market with your company by the time you built up all the infrastructure that you needed. So number one was the amount of money you need at the beginning is much, much less. The second is that you have a number of entrepreneurs who have become very successful, who in this post-internet bubble time frame started focusing on investing their money back in other startups. And that has turned into what you're referring to as super angels, which tend to be these angels that make lots of investments, at which point some of them start to raise funds, and so they end up becoming venture capitalists. And the trendy phrase for that is a micro VC. But they're really just seed fund investors. They're venture capitalists who are investing relatively small amounts of money early on in the company's life. And by the way, none of those things are new. So I sold my first company in 1990, end of 93. I made a couple of $1 million. I turned around and I invested $25,000 to $50,000 in 40 companies between 1994 and 1996. So I was a super angel. I wasn't the first. There were plenty of people before me. Right, so this idea of successful entrepreneur making some money and investing a bunch of that money in a bunch of different companies is not a new construct. And the second is this notion of micro VC is really a seed VC, and these VCs filled a hole in the market because many venture firms raised bigger and bigger funds, and they weren't very focused on the early stage investments. And what happened was there was a lot of noise around why that was. And a bunch of people, Jeff Clavier on the West Coast, the guys at First Round Capital, True Ventures, Union Square Ventures, they just stepped into the gap. And they said, well, there's lots of opportunity here to write $500,000 million checks to these entrepreneurs who are trying to start things. Let's go. And then the other thing that filled in there were the accelerators like Techstars, where all of a sudden, when you become part of Techstars, you now get $120,000 seed funding. So it's a small amount of money, but it's enough to get you, to that next level. Those are things that are exogenous to the venture capital industry. They're really being driven by the needs of the entrepreneurs and the opportunity from a funding dynamic shift. Those are the biggest things that I've seen recently.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad, for all your time. That was the last questions. Okay.
My pleasure.
Can we have a quick round of applause for Brad?
Well, thanks for having me. And if there's follow-ups or things I didn't get to, just drop me a note at brad@feld.com. I'm happy to try to respond to it. And appreciate you guys doing this via Google Hangouts. Hope it was worthwhile for you, and it was fun for me.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. See ya.
See ya.
Mouse.